Hello, everybody. I welcome you to the second lecture in the Keyano lecture series in conjunction with the Wood Buffalo Regional Library. We, of course, eternally thank the library for the use of this very lovely space for us to do our talks. Now, Kevin has allowed me to say whatever I want for his introduction. It's okay. It's fine. Oh wait, I'm supposed to say Master of the Universe, God of History.
There we go, yeah,
that's what we're looking for. Kevin, it is my great honor to present you. He is an instructor of history and upgrading at Keyano College, heavily involved in the War Museum here in town. He is a gentleman who stares unflinchingly at history to study who we were as Canadians and people to figure out, hopefully, maybe, who we could actually become in the future. So it is my pleasure to present to you Kevin Rogers.
Thank you. She said nicer things about me than I would say about me, so we'll go with that. Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for coming on what I know for some people might be a dry night. For others, it might be something that's very interesting. And for me, as a historian, especially as a military historian and an aviation geek, I rarely get the opportunity to talk about planes. Even some of you who may have interacted with me at the military museum, mostly Army stuff there, don't really get an opportunity to talk about planes, which is close to my heart. And today we're going to be talking about this plane, the great, maybe not so great, Avro Arrow. And specifically, the role that it plays in this kind of great Canadian myth. This story that we tell ourselves as Canadians, which we might find out, hopefully from today's lesson, or not lesson, but chat, sorry, teacher mode still activated, might not necessarily be completely true. So kind of the outline of what I'm going to be talking about today is we'll first discuss the contemporary mythology about the project. And that's what I'm meaning about if today we have debates going on, should we continue to buy an American aircraft? In the future, should we buy a Swedish aircraft? If you look at the comments on any social media, just go down a few comments, you'll find someone say, let's build the Avro Arrow again. And that's why I was kind of inspired when Amanda asked me, hey, could you put on a talk? And I thought, well, what kind of matters? Because in the past, I've talked about NORAD. In the past, I've talked about the war in Ukraine. And so today I thought, well, let's talk about the Avro Arrow and some of the myths around the aircraft that help us kind of understand an identity. And after that, after we talk about kind of the mythology that we have today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the project and its cancellation. We're going to examine the Arrow as a technical concept while comparing it to the contemporaries of its time. And this is something where it's really interesting to really compare this amazing jet to other jets of its time, and that helps us maybe understand a little bit more towards that cancellation. We're also going to look at the Canadian requests for proposals, which have recently been declassified, and that allows us to actually see what did the National Research Council in Ottawa have to say about this aircraft, what did the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, have to say about this aircraft, because it's all open now, and we can find out what the thinking actually was. We also investigate the important role that espionage and spies played on the cancellation of that project. And believe it or not, our spies were better than American spies for once and gave us a better, more true understanding of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. And lastly, we're going to look at the overall impact of the cancellation on the Canadian aviation industry. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about that myth. So these are all parts of the myth, right? First is that the Arrow was the most technologically advanced aircraft of its time. The Arrow was representative of a booming aviation industry post-World War II. It included new technologies that would obviously be copied by the Americans, making every American invention from 1959 to present day. There are some who believe the Arrow would still be in service today, or would have led to even more advanced designs. All right? The F-18s are old. Can't even imagine if we were flying planes from 1959, right? A big one that the project was canceled because the Americans were jealous and wanted the project to fail. And we'll talk about how the Americans were actually kind of connected to the project all in positive ways, not any negative ways, actually, from the actual documents. And connected to that, we see Diefenbaker cave to U.S. pressure and forever put Canada under the U.S. collective security environment, and we, as a result, lost our sovereignty. Lastly, that Diefenbaker, wow. It's one of those days, y'all. Okay, so Diefenbaker purchased poor performing or inferior U.S. products that were not as effective, and that the cancellation destroyed the Canadian aviation industry, and that Canada would be a more physically powerful nation today if the project was continued. And like I said, these are a lot of those myths, and you can find these online right now, on debates, on news articles, where people like to kind of propagate these myths. And myths are really interesting. I do study myths in other classes I teach. They sometimes give us a sense of, who we are as a people, where we want to be, and many of these myths kind of revolve around, do play that role in giving us maybe a national identity, even though they may be disassociated with the facts. So when we think about this to Canada then, these myths exploded in popularity online, especially when we thought about buying the CF-35A, which is very controversial. And those of you who I work with, we talk about this a lot in the lunchroom. I think we should go Swedish, but hey, that's a whole different conversation for another day. But as we're discussing, should we build planes in Canada? Should we buy from a different partner? How reliable is the United States? Because that's a question we're now asking ourselves. Well, bad day for me today. And this, to me, it's this kind of collective resentment of American influence on Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau in the 1960s actually said, I'm going to paraphrase him here, that living in Canada is very similar to sleeping next to an elephant. That every time that elephant moves, being the United States, it impacts us in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes for positive ways, sometimes for negative ways. But every time they move in that bed, we feel it. And so I feel that the Arrow is kind of being brought back to life again, these myths that may not necessarily be true because of maybe Canadian insecurities or Canadian fears about this elephant in the room next to us. Also, those of you who are in your, I guess older than your 30s might remember a made-for-TV movie called The Avro Arrow with Dan Aykroyd. Yeah, I don't know why. I guess we didn't have anything to watch in the 90s because everyone watched it. And that had a lot of role in pushing these myths. It's a great made-for-TV miniseries or movie, but it does kind of push this, American boogeyman mentality, which when we look at the declassified sources, frankly, just isn't there. So the myth then reflects Canadian history and Canadian achievement and how we always kind of feel overlooked. We always feel that, we're that baby brother to the United States in some way, that the world sees us as less technological, less significant, less powerful. And I think the Arrow kind of plays a role in, this, or at least those myths around the Arrow play a role in this, us wanting to be heard and wanting to feel felt. Next, this myth also really pushes what I call a great Canadian tradition. Let's blame government for everything, all right? The heart of the matter, Avro went bankrupt, not the Canadian government. Avro made decisions as a business which caused their business to fail. That is not necessarily Diefenbaker's fault, but we see this throughout many industries in Canada. Right? If Ford's struggling, well, why didn't the Canadian government help Ford? We kind of fall on that corporate interests. Sometimes we try to blame government for problems that are actually in the private sector. And this as well relates to public anger for Diefenbaker and an economic crisis he didn't make. So here we have our mini-series. And by the way, when some people think about this issue with the Americans bullying us, they have a story that John F. Kennedy had a bad relationship with Diefenbaker. Yeah, he did, 2 years after the Arrow was canceled. So while this is going on, we have bosom buddies here of Eisenhower and Diefenbaker. They're kind of connected together, and they appear to have a very strong relationship together, as opposed to that myth that says they did not get along. That was with Kennedy, who famously did not get along well with Diefenbaker. All right, so moving to this kind of next step. When we have to look at, was the aircraft good? Did it fulfill what Canada was looking for? We have to look at the request for proposals. So when we, as a country, want a new aircraft or a new tank or a new warship or anything like that, the D&D or Department of National Defense will put out a request for proposals, and they'll say, here's the things we're looking for. Now, when it went to the Avro Arrow, Canada, or the RCAF, was very specific in what we wanted, but we didn't get any of that. So that does play a role. So I've kind of divided this section into what was Canada looking for and what was Avro looking for. So first of all, when it came to Canada, the project that would become the Arrow was to replace the CF-100 all-weather interceptor, which was widely purchased around Europe and was kind of a technological marvel of the early 1950s. But by the time we're getting to the later 1950s, it's a straight wing. It doesn't, break the sound barrier. It's a good piece of aircraft, but it's just starting to age. So the Canadian kind of government's perspective is, we want a CF-100 that flies faster than the speed of sound. That was pretty much what they were looking for. Something that was incremental. This was, there was also substantial export potential to existing operators of the CF-100, including the United States was kicking around, as was the United Kingdom, as the United States would eventually buy the Canberra bomber and use it in a role that they were debating about using what we call the CF-103 in a few minutes. So there's this kind of idea that if we have an incremental improvement on the plane that people already own and love, well, we're more likely to see other countries buy it, which will take that burden off of Canadian taxpayers. So Canada wanted new engines, new radars, and to add missiles instead of guns. And this would change the nature of air war, because we're starting to, by 1955 to 1956, look at what we call second generation jets. These are jets that are breaking the sound barrier, that are relying on missiles instead of machine guns. And Canada wants to get in on that, right? But an incremental improvement over the CF-100. By the 1950s as well, the Soviet Union develops unique nuclear weapons, and the fear of nuclear war spreads, and that spreads throughout all of society. The fear of the bomber gap, which we'll talk about a little bit later in my presentation, also placed a renewed emphasis on continental defense. So Canada, not only did we want something we could sell other people, we wanted something that would operate well in Europe and something that would operate well in continental North America as well. And here we have the actual plane we should all be paying attention to, the CF-100, the only jet designed in Canada and built in Canada. And these will serve into the late 1980s, 1988, 1989, as a photo reconnaissance and electronic warfare platform in North Bay. So they're around. And here we can see the actual mock-up of what the Canadian government was looking for. This is the CF-103. Looks very similar to the first plane, more modern engines, better radar, swept wings so it goes faster. And Canada, this was really what we were looking for. But then we have to compare this to what Avro's looking for. Because Avro, they don't necessarily, or at least the archives and the sources, don't show that they were envisioning this as a Canadian plane. They were envisioning this as a corporate plane that they could sell to many people, and their largest order they thought would actually come from the UK. So they were looking into using that Canadian request for proposal to use Canadian tax dollars to help them design an airplane that they could sell to everybody around the world. So they have kind of a different way of looking at this than the Canadian government did. So Avro is really looking to increase research and development on specific technologies that would help modernize the company into kind of a new era, if you will. Avro was looking past the Canadian project towards the European market, and the UK had a lot of interest in a developmental stage where they prioritized speed and climb. However, this was often at the expense of range, because if we're looking at a country like the UK, they don't have to fly very far to be within their borders. Compare that to Canada, that has the huge borders, and our geographies have very specific sets of requirements. So Avro as well is looking around, and every aircraft company is trying to get in on the second generation market. So their competitors included things like Saab, English Electric, Dassault, Lockheed, Grumman, McDonnell, Douglas, Convair, Northrop, Vought, Hawker, de Havilland, and Avro UK, the AVRO, right? And all capitalized. That's where we're looking at the UK. So when we're looking at these aircraft and we're looking at the kind of competitive nature of the late 1950s, Avro is trying to use Canadian taxpayer dollars to make sure that they can have something that they could sell to more people. And so their motives were, again, when I talk about in Canada, we like to, focus on the government's role, but Avro's not really making the product that Canada is looking for them to make. All right, and here we have the Arrow in my hometown of Trenton, Ontario. So it was there. All right, so the CF-105 Arrow then. It was to be, when I want to look at here is what the design was supposed to be. So the design behind the Arrow was to be a modern interceptor. Whatever that was the marketing. Just said modern, modern, modern. The role was to shoot down Soviet bombers, both in Europe as well as in North America, because if we have nuclear weapons, they are going to be delivered in the late 1950s, not by ICBMs, but instead by nuclear bombers that will be flying over either the North Pole, or if we're thinking about the NATO context, going to be coming from Poland, East Germany, over the Rhine to attack NATO countries in Europe. And when we talk about the important role that Canada is looking at for Europe as well, when we look at the division of the Canadian Air Force, most of the Canadian Air Force is in Europe in the 1950s. It is not in Canada. We have the vast majority of our air forces are located in Europe as part of that NATO mission. So this aircraft as well will be influenced by American fears of the bomber gap, as well as the launch of Sputnik. These would include fly-by-wire systems, which were a first for the RCAF. However, the A4 actually beat them by a few months, and the fly-by-wire didn't really work well. It's not till we get to more modern aircraft like the F-16 that we see fly-by-wire actually being very effective. So we can dream about adding something to an aircraft, doesn't mean it's going to work out very well because the limitations of 1950s technology were still there. The Arrow would include a Hughes fire control system, as well as the Oneida Iroquois engines. The aircraft was also huge. Now, there is a mock-up of the Arrow at the Reynolds Museum in Wetaskiwin. Unfortunately, when I went to visit last year with my daughter, it was locked up for some reason. They didn't put it on display. But it comes out every now and then. The Arrow would not fit in this room. It is a huge aircraft. And that becomes, in many ways, its Achilles heel. So it was huge by the standards and even larger than almost every bomber from World War II. So speed was to be a priority in design, and design incorporated delta wings. And delta wings produced a lot of drag during maneuvers. So it's really good going in a straight line, but the second you try to turn, that speed will bleed off immediately. That's why today we really don't have many delta-winged aircraft. So it also had a short range, terrible turn radius, and would be armed with new missiles like the Velvet Glove that was to be designed. It was a Canadian designed missile that, spoiler alert, Avro couldn't get it to work. Canadair couldn't get it to work, so we had to switch to an American Falcon IR missile, which I thought about bringing today because I have a few of them in the museum collection. But last time I did a talk on NORAD, I was carrying one of these missiles in the hallway, and my dean gave me some weird looks. So thought maybe it's not best to walk through Mack Island with a missile. So keys to this design as well, to make this go quicker, would be an internal weapons bay. So the weapons would be stored inside a bomb bay, and they would be opened and then fired. And this again would be another Achilles heel, because you have a small weapons bay. Actually, the weapons bay was large, but you are limited by what will fit inside that bay in order to keep up that speed. So here's an artist's rendering of what the Arrow was supposed to look like. Didn't quite get there, but that was the design of the designers as they were submitting this as actually the cover for their proposal that they wrote to the National Research Institute in Ottawa. So several prototypes would be built, with each one fixing problems. And this was a unique design style that the Avro would use, which is rarely used in aircraft, and where you build a prototype, then you find out what's wrong with it, then you fix it. Then you build a second prototype, and you find out what's wrong with that one, then you fix it, and a third, fourth, and fifth. And what that means is a lot of your prototypes are having multitude of problems. You're not necessarily solving those problems. Everything is incremental. It is a very expensive way to do it, but it was the way Avro went about that. It was one of the first aircraft as well. When we talk about the American role, the Americans actually allowed us for the first time of any Allied aircraft to be wind tunnel tested in the United States at the Smithsonian. So that was huge. And again, if we believe that myth that the Americans want this project to fail, they seem to be doing a lot to help us out with the project. Something else we have, this is a B-47 American nuclear bomber that the Americans gave to us to test the engine, which you can see is kind of stuck on the side here, of the Avro Arrow. Now the engine was so powerful it actually started to rip the structure of the B-47, and we ended up just throwing it into the Pima Air and Space Museum, and the aircraft never flew again. So again, if we say that myth is that the Americans wanted this to fail, they seem to be doing an awful lot to try to help us along with this project. So next, I'm going to break this down into some of the myths that I started to talk about at the beginning. Now, I'll take a short break. Does anybody have any questions? I know I'm talking a mile a minute here and geek out about aircraft. That's kind of my default position. Everyone's good? Okay.
Well, actually,
yeah.
So there were no external hard points?
None whatsoever. Nor was there any plumbing, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, for external fuel tanks, which is a huge oversight, because that's going to be one of the reasons the Arrow gets canceled. So everything they're going for is speed, but just speed in almost like a test environment. It's like if we took a drag racer, right? It's not a good car. It's fast, but it can't turn, can't do any of those things. Avro is looking at using this aircraft to make money, and they want to win competitions that they know the UK is going to ask for, that the USAF is going to ask for, and they're not necessarily looking for this to be a Canadian jet that they were asking, that the RCAF wanted. All right? So, another myth. Arrow was the fastest aircraft of its day. So let's have a look at this. I've put together a speed chart, and these are of aircraft that were either in development at the exact same time or in service. None of these aircraft are newer than the Arrow was. So all of these were already around or in further stages of development. So the Avro Arrow Mark I would fly with American engines, J57s that they lent us, again, surprisingly supporting the project along. And it would go Mach 1.98, which is that kind of Mach speed. So almost Mach 2, but not quite there. The Mark III Arrow was supposed to have the Iroquois, those Oneida engines, but it could go maybe Mach 2 plus is what the company said. We have no idea how fast it could actually go. Estimates from the wind tunnel testing say probably only Mach 2.1. So it was not actually going to be that fast overall. Then we have the aircraft that replaced it, the Voodoo. It's the only one in red because it was slower. It was only Mach 1.72. But again, we're seeing it's 3 years older. The F-104 Starfighter, another aircraft that the Canadians would buy, was a Mach 2 plane, again coming from 1954. The F-105 Thunderchief, Mach 2.1, 1955. The Delta Dart, which really looks like an Avro Arrow, but is a few years older than the Avro Arrow, was a Mach 2.3. The English Electric Lightning, Mach 2.27. And importantly, and this is kind of lost, at the same time that the Arrow's coming out, one of the best aircraft of the 20th century, the F-4 Phantom, which, again, I'll show you some pictures of these in a few minutes, you'd probably recognize from every Vietnam War movie, from things like Top Gun, even though it's not the star of Top Gun, they're in the background. This aircraft is still operational around the world today. That F-4 Phantom is also happening at the same time. So again, this is where we're hitting the third generation of jets, while we're still trying to figure out the second generation of jets. We have things like the Mirage 3, Mach 2.2, MiG-21, Mach 2.05, and the Saab Draken at Mach 2.3. So the reason I give you these is, for a plane that's supposed to be built on speed, why is it one of the slowest? And the reason behind that is just size. Because when we're looking at aviation, as a pilot myself, when we're looking at how things move, we have thrust versus drag. The bigger you make your plane, right? And the more drag you have, the worse it is. We have lift versus weight. So as you're trying to make this aircraft bigger to fit bigger engines, sometimes you're actually making it slower because you're trying to make the engines fit. So it's kind of this trade-off, if you will, that maybe Avro could have got correct. They might have, if we were talking about a Mark V Arrow or something like that, but we don't even know what that would have looked like on the drawing boards. And quite frankly, if we looked at something that would have solved this problem, some estimates say if they had 7 or 8 years, they could have solved that. And all of a sudden, we're looking at 1967, 1968, and the F-15 is flying, which, again, is one of the best aircraft ever built. So I don't really know if the Avro would have had the time to solve this when we look at these different types of aircraft. So when we're looking at this, the reason I put this chart together is we're wondering, why did the Dutch say no? Why did the Germans say no? Why did the UK pass? Well, when you're looking at the competitors, it's not really standing out at the one thing it's supposed to stand out for. Another myth. It was a long-range interceptor, and this is what will actually kill the Arrow for the Canadians. Here's our range. Now, I put combat range, and combat range is different than ferry range. Ferry range would be how far it could fly without having to come back. So combat range is you put bombs and missiles on it, how far could it fly and come back to that base. All right? So Avro Arrow, a meager 438 kilometers. So it could not make Edmonton from Fort McMurray, which is maybe not the best, right? The Avro Arrow Mark III, we don't even know. It might have done something. Compare that to the Voodoo, 1,200 kilometers. Huge bump up in that range. It's slower, but man, it can actually get to where you want to go. We had the Starfighter, 1954 kilometers. The Thunderchef, 1,252 kilometers. The Delta Dart, 930 kilometers. The Lightning, that one wasn't very good, only 250 kilometers. So that might have trouble getting the CRNRL back. I don't know what's going on with that plane. The F-4 Phantom, only 680 kilometers internally, but it was plumbed so that you could have fuel tanks and drop tanks on it, which added up to about 1,340 kilometers. Again, the Mirage, 1,200 kilometers, and again, you could fit probably 2 Mirages under the Avro Arrow. The MiG-21, only 660 kilometers, but the Russians didn't really care about that too much. They just put lots of MiGs out there. And then we had the Saab with only 450 kilometers of range, similar to the Arrow, but look at with drop tanks, 3,200 kilometers of range. So it seems like Avro forgot a step, and not plumbing the wings was a problem. But if we go to plumb the wings so that they could have hard points on them, they would have to restructure the entire aircraft, adding even more weight. So Avro really doesn't know how to solve this issue. Yeah.
How much of this that you're showing us right now is the stuff that was declassified? Was this stuff that was
none of this stuff is declassified. The first things I talked about, but none of the range, that was all well known.
So, because I clearly remember when I was a kid, everyone was like, Avro Arrow is like the fastest plane around. But
That's the myth. That's what I'm saying.
it's very interesting that this isn't stuff that was
Yeah.
right.
This is right out there in the open, in the promotional materials for all these companies.
Is it more of like a pride thing at that point then?
I think so. That's what I'm saying. It's a myth because we don't know where it comes from, right? It's not like the legend of the Avro Arrow where we have an idea. It's where did someone told this story once and said, oh my gosh, it was the fastest thing. And it just stuck. But unfortunately, it wasn't.
Well, I remember I was young during the election campaign.
Mhm.
The whole government was labeled as incompetent.
Yeah.
The whole Arrow project, from a political sense, was labeled incompetent, regardless of the pass rate.
Yeah, and you could call that part of a really effective liberal electoral policy. But a lot of these myths, they're only growing with time. We have all this information. This is something that many of us see. The world has more information than we've ever seen before, but we don't use it well, right? We don't use it to disprove what we hope to know. And even myself, if I went back 10 years ago, I would be saying these same things. Oh yeah, the Arrow was great. It was awesome. We should have built them. You know, Kennedy, Diefenbaker. But when we start to look at not only what's declassified, but what is openly available to us, we can kind of see why the UK said, yeah, we're good, thanks. We'll go with something else, right? So for interest, every one of these circles is the maximum range of the Arrow, put on the Canadian map, from CFB Cold Lake, CFB Winnipeg, CFB North Bay, and CFB Bagotville. Those are the main fighter bases at the time.
So it's basically only like a close combat air patrol.
And it can't turn. Because that delta wing, in fact, they found out when they flew it to Trenton, the reason they had to fly from Toronto to Trenton is it's a straight line. Can't turn. Not very well. It would run out of gas trying to turn around. So this is, again, it's a great drag racer. Well, actually, it's not that great because it wasn't that fast. But when we start to look at things and you put this visualization up, you're going to need, you could make this work, but how many more circles are you going to need? A lot more. You're going to have to talk about bases in Yellowknife, the Yukon, definitely something in BC, right? Newfoundland, Maritimes. Apparently Maritimes don't matter, but we could probably put something over there to try to protect the Maritimes. I know, but that's what I'm saying is that it just doesn't mathematically add up.
Kind of analyzing backwards, but at the time, were they aware of what you're sharing? Like,
Yes.
it was a thing that was
Yes.
talked about.
It was absolutely talked about, and I will show you some documents in a few minutes from that declassified, where the RCAF is basically saying, we don't want this, right? We just, thanks. And then there's this debate will be, how much are the jobs worth? Should we buy a bad airplane for Canada to keep some people employed? That's the debate about the Avro Arrow from the Diefenbaker government. It's never excitement about the plane. It's always, how much are the jobs worth? All right? So, a lot of this was because of design compromise. First of all, to fit the Iroquois engine that they had a stake in, they would make more money off of, the aircraft had to be too big, had to be too heavy, and that created a lot of the aerodynamic problems. The Arrow was also larger than most of, if not some of the bombers that it would try to intercept, which meant that they could outturn it, which is not really what you want from an interceptor. The design called for completely clean lines, and that meant that it had no fuel tanks being able to put on the outside, no missiles you were being able to put on the outside. The Arrow also lacked an ability to mount a cannon, which in 1958 nobody cared about, but aviation geeks or people who have looked at the history of military aviation will know that the Vietnam War showed us probably need a cannon on that aircraft, right? For the Phantoms had to put the cannon on everything since the Vietnam War. We realized you might need a gun on it too. So the Arrow also scored poor on range and maneuverability while not reaching anywhere near the promised speeds for its design. So from this, we can see it was a flawed design. But that, again, goes against a lot of those myths. Now, when I'm talking about better competitors, the prototype excited very few in other countries. Nobody was really interested. Poor range meant that you could not launch multiple sorties. In a perfect world, if I go back to my, too far, picture here. If someone's coming out of the North Pole, in a perfect world, you could fly up, shoot at them, go back, reload, fly up again, shoot at them, and go back and reload. But that low range meant that you had to fight only in that circle. And that meant you would not get another opportunity to go back and reload and fight again. Most of Europe at this time as well was looking to buy new NATO ecosystems that would use similar weapons and systems that could be shared from aircraft to aircraft. And that Sentry series, all those F-10 somethings that I was talking about a few minutes ago, were really good at that. Avro, trying to make money, said if you buy the Arrow, you'll need to use our missile.
So it's an iPhone.
It's an iPhone, yeah. Right? This USB-C doesn't work, right? Our missile, our radar, our tires, our wheels, our engine, and more of these countries are saying, we're kind of out. Very similar to what the debate Canada's having in reverse of the F-35. As the Americans are saying, oh, you need to use our everything, and Canada's a little bit worried about relying on one source. But the Americans are a much bigger source than Canada was, even back in the day. So, Avro's design, just too proprietary. It required users to buy completely into their ecosystem, and they wanted that, like Apple, to make some cash. Internal weapons bays also limited weapons that could be used and limited upgradability. A two-man crew also put a lot of pressure on smaller air forces like the Netherlands, who could not necessarily staff 2 people in each jet. They were looking for 1 person in each jet at this point in time. So looking at some of those competitors, this is what Canada eventually bought for a great deal. We got a great fire sale deal on the Voodoo, but more on that later. So this is that Voodoo, again, slower, but can fly all the way to the Arctic without having those same problems. This is the F-104, which Canada would eventually, 1 year after the Arrow was canceled, we would buy several hundred of these, building them all in Montreal. So we'll get to that a little bit later about this so-called destruction of the Canadian aviation industry. This is Delta Dart, the Phantom, which I said, by the way, if there was an open competition, the Phantom would have won, right, against the Arrow. It's ugly. It's ugly. This is the Saab that I was talking about. The Mirage, they're really, talking about ugly, they're really ugly English Electric Lightning. It's British, and you can tell. All right? So I love my Spitfire, don't get me wrong, but this comes from the Hurricane. So, and this is, of course, our MiG-21, right, which is going to be so mass-produced that it's just going to be everywhere, still is today. So, domestic failures then. Now we're getting into a bit that's declassified. So, the Arrow did not just struggle on the international market for the reasons we've talked about so far. It was also just not that aircraft I said that the Canadian government wanted. We wanted an CF-100 that could go a little faster, that had a little bit more missiles. Instead, we got something brand new that didn't work, didn't fly. It was not really what we were looking for. So the Arrow also failed to meet dozens of requirements set up out by the Canadian government. Try to grab out here. And not working for me there. It's not letting me switch over, but that's okay. Life goes on. There is a 355-page document set out by the National Research Institute in Canada, National Research Council, and the RCAF of all of the problems with the Arrow. These were everything from the ejection seat went down instead of up. Not a good idea, because if you're trying to land, squish, right? Now universally, we know up is the better option than down, right? The tires were poor quality. Where the landing lights were supposed to be was wrong. So again, a 300-page document, which is now declassified and available to us, where the Canadian government and our scientists at the National Research Council is saying, don't buy this. This is, by the time we get through fixing all of these problems, the F-15's around, right? And that's what I said earlier. When we have all these problems, the Avro said, no problem. We have all these problems. We'll solve them. Just give us a few $100 million more, and we will get right to it. But this was pushing the plane back farther to all of a sudden, like I said, we're now talking F-15s, F-16s, F-18s, right? And a whole different world of aviation.
How much money was spent on this?
I'll get there. $600 million in 1959 money, which is, yeah, that's a fair share, right? So in a 1955 letter from the National Research Council to the RCAF, they noted how Avro was not open to any feedback nor making any attempts. And here's that letter, if I can get that. Yeah, we're going. There's the letter. This is the cover page of that big report. Again, declassified 2016. And it basically says the company's evident desire to sell you an aircraft as it stands, in spite of a shortage of inherent stability and combat load factor, criticism by us and was strongly resented. They weren't open to listening because Avro said, yeah, if there's a problem, fix it after you buy it. But for Canada, we're starting to really wonder, why should we buy this in the first place? I don't know.
Military supply companies, they do that down, they still do it down.
Yeah, and potentially. This is very weird even for Avro, because they had no problems with CF-100. It was great. Came out, did what it wanted to do, bought it cash money, everybody bought it. It was a good plane. But it seems like Avro is trying to make a lot of money off of this and set themselves up for the next generation of whatever they were trying to do, that it doesn't make sense anymore, right? So the Arrow was proving to be expensive. We had $300 million in 1959, with them asking for $200 million more before a single aircraft is produced. Yeah, that's the face that Diefenbaker probably gave. All right. The lack of capability also would push up costs, because remember that map I showed you? You need more than 3 squadrons. You're going to need hundreds of Avro Arrows to cover the distance then. And that's going to continue to push up costs. And those hundreds of Arrows are going to need hundreds of crews, hundreds of maintenance crews, hundreds of spare engines. And you can see Avro just thinking cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. But the Canadian government, which is about to hit a massive recession, is kind of thinking the opposite.
Lack of maneuverability, just would have been cannon fodder in.
Absolutely. So it was also becoming unlikely that any foreign orders would provide any sufficient economy of scale to make the aircraft affordable. To keep Avro in business then, the RCAF would need to purchase substantial numbers of Arrows, into the several hundred, it was estimated, just to keep this company in business.
200 million in today's worth is 2 billion.
Yeah.
200 million is 2 billion.
Nuts. Then we start and that's 300 million plus, so there's 5 billion before a plane's produced. Oh no, right? And then you have that debate over sunk cost, right? It's like, well, we already paid this much. You can talk yourself into anything then, right? So there were a variety of other weapons programs in this time period. We needed new warships. We needed new maritime patrol aircraft. We needed new transport planes. We needed new tanks. And basically, the government and the Department of National Defense is looking at this and saying, we can't afford this because it will be the entire military budget just to keep Avro in business. And here's Diefenbaker. Scary face. I don't know. I'd want a second picture taken. Clean that up with AI or something there. I don't know. So in 1957, Diefenbaker was elected with reform in mind, and he was elected to fix the spending problem of the Liberals. The Liberals had spent money willy-nilly, and this was causing all types of problems. And if you just kind of elect a country boy from Saskatchewan, he'll get things sorted out. That's his kind of shtick, if you will. He wanted to focus on legal reforms and on expanding economic growth in Canada's north. Many of Diefenbaker's policies, though, would become unfulfilled as a deep recession hit. And Canadian taxpayer dollars started to come short. So the recession forced the government to look for ways to cut spending. And the big one in exclamation marks in flashing red was the Avro Arrow. That was on the list. So connected to this is where I talked about intelligence failures. And that's something we call the bomber gap. Now, this takes place in the late 1950s and is the whole reason we even have the term the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower, on his way out, warns everybody that, hey, things are not going well in the United States when it comes to the role of private companies and the role of the military being kind of connected to who is providing for who. So in 1949, Soviets get their first weapons, but nuclear weapons in 1949 are going to be delivered by aircraft that are knockoffs of the B-29 Superfortress. Eventually, though, the Soviets start to build more modern aircraft. But tensions continue to grow. The Korean War, tensions in Germany, and the crushing of the Hungarian revolt would inflame all of these tensions between the Soviets and NATO. In 1955, at an Aviation Day parade, the Soviet Air Force showed off its newest and greatest bomber, the M4 Bison. Here's the thing. They're spies. They're watching the parades. And what the Soviets do is they know spies are watching the parades. So they choose to fly an 8-ship formation over, so 8 flying. They go in the clouds, immediately turn around, come back, and join the back of the line. So it looks like look at all of these bombers, there's so many, and it's the same ones just doing circles, right? But the person on the ground just thought, oh my, if you're working for the CIA or you're working for the RCMP, you're like, wow, there's so many of these bombers. Why would you build so many bombers? And the only answer is you plan on losing a bunch of them over to the North Pole by attacking us. So that's what we mean by the bomber gap. The American Air Force immediately gets a hold of this and they say, we need B-52s, we need more bombers, and we need to build lots of interceptors to be able to fight this battle because they think the Soviets are ready to make a move. All right? Now, Eisenhower, ever the cautious guy, decides, well, I don't really know about this. So he activates, here we see the M4 Bison in the air, a new top secret weapon called the U-2 spy plane. And he says, fly over an airfield in the Soviet Union and count how many bombers they have, because I don't really know if I can believe the parade. But man, did they fly over the wrong airfield. They flew over an airfield with 28 M4 Bison bombers. All 28 on one airfield. They happened to all be there. And then they said, well, there's hundreds of airfields. So let's do some multiplication. If there's 28 at this airfield, then there must be 28 at every airfield. And they came up with a number of 800 of them. There were never more than 28. That was the full production run. Yeah, only 28. Yeah. Declassified by the RCMP. And only one works. In fact, they get retired really quickly because they don't even have the range to fly to Canada. But again, it's all a smoke and mirrors. Ironically, the Americans do the exact same thing when they see the MiG-25, and they think it's a whole different aircraft later on, but that's a story for a different, less boring day, I guess. Yes, Clint Eastwood. So the U.S. and the Western, what's that?
Firefox.
Was it Firefox? Oh, okay, yeah, I like that movie. Yeah. Yeah, so the U.S. and Western military industrial complexes expanded then. And in these recent declassified documents show that in 1949, the RCMP actually had human intelligence that said there's only 28. And that was something that Diefenbaker had that Eisenhower didn't. And so Diefenbaker basically says, should I trust the RCMP? And the RCMP say, we're very confident in this. And then MI6 concurs, which is the British spy agency. So the British and the Canadians go, well, I guess there's no bomber gap. And this is part of the reason that we see people like Eisenhower on his way out after losing that election. Not losing the election, he basically walks off into the sunset finally. And he says, everybody be warned, there's a military-industrial complex in the United States, and that's where we get that term from, right? That these companies are saying, hey, you need to buy more of these things. Instead, we learned that the Soviets are investing heavily in intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? That's the Soviet way. So here we see the U-2. Now, once we realize the bomber gap's not real, we have to think about what are we going to do long term. And one big thing that we see individuals like Diefenbaker trying to do is have a better relationship with the United States. Again, throughout this whole Avro Arrow project, they have not been bullies. They have not been trying to make us do anything. And maybe we should be closer to the United States for continental defense. So the RCAF and the USAF begin to look at missile defense systems. Gotta take a sip here. Now, something that's interesting is Diefenbaker did not cut the Diefenbunker, which was his nuclear bunker outside of Arnprior in Ontario. I've been there myself. It makes no sense because it only took 8 minutes for a missile to hit, and it's 40 minutes away from Ottawa. I don't really know the geography there. But this is a time period where we're now thinking, well, the Russians will probably get through. We're going to lose some cities if there's a war. So what do we do then to either strike back or have the greatest influence? So we develop in 1957 NORAD, right? North American Air Defense Agency, which I talked about last year. So part of that agreement was that Canada, not the US, Canada wanted in on SAGE, which was the US defensive shield. All right? Part of this were these, Beaumarks. They are, I guess you would call them today almost a drone, but they're classified as a missile. It wasn't known until recently that they had nuclear tips. By recently, I'm meaning like 2002, 2003. It was speculated. But I actually remember, I went to University in North Bay. I remember going to Swiss Chalet with my wife and watching these things go down the road. I was like, okay, well, there's a nuclear missile, 2 nuclear missiles, 3 nuclear missiles. Canada did have nuclear missiles, but they were technically American warheads on a Canadian missile. That was that kind of go-around, if you will. And so part of SAGE was, if we can't afford to put Avro arrows everywhere, these missiles are very survivable, and they might miss. But they didn't have to get that close. The idea was if you get this missile close to the Russian aircraft or Soviet aircraft, a nuclear bomb would go off in the air, causing them all to crash. So these were a way to supplement any kind of interceptor. And then the Diefenbaker government said, we still should have an interceptor, so maybe we should look at that really good deal that the US is offering us on some used CF-100 Voodoos. All right? So many Canadians look at this part of the myth and say, traitor. Gave up a Canadian aircraft for Beaumarks that were not a good missile, because they weren't, but again, it's 1959. And a CF-101, which actually proved to be a very good fighter and would be retired by Canada in the late 1980s. Here's the building of the Diefenbunker. So this gets me to that kind of last step, which is that myth that Diefenbaker betrayed Canada, and because of that, we lost all of our manufacturing. And again, I'm going to disprove that myth. With no bomber gap driving the need for new interceptors and a poor economy, Canada had to make a different choice. We could not keep putting money into a broken program. So the US had also, during that time period where we thought there was a bomber gap, bought far too many interceptors. And they offered us a sweetheart deal on American-bought F-101s that hadn't been flown. So they've been bought, but they have 0 kilometers basically on the engine. So it's a really good used car deal, if you will, right? And they're offering to us basically pennies on the dollar. And that's a great deal. Because if you remember back to the range, well, the Voodoo could fly to the north. Couldn't fly as fast, but it could definitely get there, and it was faster than a bomber. And if we supplement the Voodoo with these fancy Beaumark missiles, then maybe we have a good system here. So the Arrow had underperformed, and it would take massive investments to correct the flaws. Avro had sunk its entire future into a plane that it couldn't get to work. Canada could not afford such a large order with the recession, the Cold War, and that Canada wanted different weapons. When Canada canceled the Avro Arrow, Avro was over-leveraged and had no other product awaiting development. No contracts on the books. It thought about a flying saucer. It thought about some other ideas, but none of them were anywhere close to a fully thought-out idea. And Avro closed. Yes?
Avro, I'm a soils nerd, not a plane nerd.
Yep.
Avro's primarily, were they the 100 before?
Yes.
Okay, so they did the CF100.
They made lots of money and they wasted it all on, right? So they just moved too fast, right? So here's our Canadian Voodoo. Ugly again. It's ugly, man. Yeah. But it did its job, and it did so affordably, safely, for a long period of time. Had very low accident rates, and served again into the late 1980s. So, another part of the controversy. We destroyed all of the prototypes. Dan Aykroyd said that was bad. So we have to ask ourselves, why did they do that? And again, it's time to get into declassified information. So, since the Guzenko affair in the late 1940s, we come to a realization that there's massive spy rings in Canada from the Soviets, right? And we are becoming very aware that they had infiltrated most of our civil society. The RCMP at this point in time are really over spying on Canadians. That's not the right word there. They're spying on us too much. Like, this is the era where if you were gay, there was a file about you, right? Because they were worried that, you could be leveraged, right? So the RCMP heavily involved in spying on Canadians. And there was a deep fear of that Soviet spying. There was also fear that the USSR could have received data from the prototypes and the designs. There was even confirmation that there were likely spies in Avro. So the RCAF then, technically, Canada, we bought those jets, not Avro, and we said, we're not willing to risk this, and we want it chopped up, which I hate. As a historian, as somebody, I'd love to put one of these at our museum. We don't have the money for that. I would love it, though. I mean, if I'm dreaming, let me dream, Put it right beside the Spitfire. I'm dreaming here, okay? Yeah, right? And so a lot of these were destroyed. Actually, all of these were destroyed. There's another myth that there's one at CFB Mountain View. And not to push myths, I think I saw it. Okay? When I was an air cadet, I did a lot of work at CFB Mountain View, snuck into one of the hangars I wasn't supposed to. There was a big plane under a tarp. I swear I saw a red wingtip. So, well, take that as you will, right? Whether it's sitting there in southern Ontario, I don't know. But conspiracies just fall. When you destroy all the prototypes, there's got to be something there, right? Sounds like a great conspiracy. But again, declassified documents tell us, well, we knew there were spies in Avro. We wanted them destroyed. We've been embarrassed by the Guzenko affair. We want to make sure the world trusts us. And Avro, sorry, we can't buy your stuff. So at the end of the day, there's no conspiracy. Destruction of the prototypes was definitely not ordered by the United States, as some people may want us to think. Relations, again, between Diefenbaker and Eisenhower were excellent, but the relationship began to sour when Kennedy came, as Kennedy, I believe, quoted saying that Diefenbaker was a yokel. I'm not sure on that. But Kennedy's Kennedy, it's a different era in the 1960s. So here we have a picture of all the jets being chopped up. Now for conspiracies, you'll notice 201, 203, 204, and 205. Where's 202? All right? Anyway, I just got to throw some conspiracies in there, right?
How many were actually made?
5. Yeah. All right, next myth. The cancellation of the project destroyed Canadian high-tech manufacturing and the aviation industry, with thousands leaving to work in the United States, and that was all the evil design of the United States. All right? Well, thousands of workers did lose their jobs, and it was awful. Awful for their families. The vast majority, though, were factory workers. Factory workers who could find employment in the Greater Toronto area for Ford, for Chevrolet, Canadair. It was unfortunate, but many did eventually find other employment in Canada. The company was unable to continue operations. The simpler plan that Canada had asked for probably would have been bought and there would have been no issues. It was estimated that 25,000 direct and indirect jobs were lost. Many who lost their jobs were hired in other booming markets, and many engineers would have to move on to other projects. But it's important to note that there are not thousands of engineers. There are thousands of factory workers and dozens of engineers. Okay? If the Arrow had been bought, the engineers would have been unemployed anyway. The project would have been over, and they would have found work someplace else. So yes, it's awful that 32 engineers lost their jobs, right? But we can't compare that. Sometimes that myth tells us 25,000 engineers lost their jobs. That's a huge loss of engineering talent. 32, that's unfortunate, but I think we've seen similar problems up in the oil industry with 32 people losing their jobs in a day, right? So, most engineers continued to live and work in Canada. Some would move to the United States. 2 prominent engineers would be James Chamberlain and Owen Maynard, who would design both the Gemini space capsule as well as the lunar lander. 2 engineers, which probably would have been poached anyway when we're thinking about that, right? We also have to ask ourselves, well, if we're going to really get into conspiracies and thinking about the future, if the Arrow hadn't been canceled, these guys wouldn't have been employed by NASA, and maybe we didn't land on the moon before the Russians, and yada, yada, yada. You know what I mean? You could play that goal. History tends to flow a certain way, and we are a byproduct of history the way it worked. So that brings me to the big brother of Avro, the actual big producer in Canadian aviation, Canadair. So the cancellation of Arrow did not destroy the Canadian aviation industry. It was alive and well, continues to be alive and well in Canada today. The reallocation of funds from the Arrow allowed Canada to invest in other technologies, like the CF-104 day fighter, new warships, and new vehicles. Those all created new jobs that wouldn't have been there if all the money had gone to the Avro Arrow. So we have to then balance those jobs that were created versus the jobs that were lost from Avro. Canadair, that company, would go on to build in Canada with Canadian employees, Canadianized versions of the CF-104 fighter, the CP-107 Argus, which was Canadian designed, Canadian built, the CT-114 Tudor, a CC-106 Yukon, the CC-109 Cosmopolitan, and all of this before 1962. All of this between the Arrow and 1962, Canadair is building. So the aviation industry is quite not dead. Later on, the CF-5 fighters as well as the C-144 Challengers would be built by Canadair in Canada as well. The company Oneida that built the engine that was supposed to go in to the Avro Arrow is still today under Bombardier building aircraft engines, as it's been kind of bought and sold and spun off in a million different directions. So all of those employees just built American engines for aircraft. And that's not really what we want. We'd love to have a Canadian design. But if we're just going to talk about employment, I don't think the factory worker cared if they were building an American engine or a Canadian engine, so long as the paycheck was coming in, right? And so we can't say, again, that the Canadian aviation industry was stifled. In fact, this is the Argus, beautiful aircraft. It's ugly too, but it's beautiful. And was the best maritime patrol aircraft well into the 1980s again. And it was designed in Canada, manufactured in Canada. We have our Tudor jets. Otherwise, you probably know these with snowbirds. I don't know why we are still flying these, but I guess we got no other better options.
Don't knock belt crank and push one.
Here's our Cosmopolitans, right? All again made in those same years. Here's the Starfighter, made in those same years. Here's the F-5, made in those same years. Still being flown by the Venezuelan Air Force. And I hear the United States is moving an aircraft carrier because they're terrified of these guys. So we'll see what happens with that. And the last one, the Challenger, which would become just that Bombardier business jet. The descendant of this, we're actually starting to see into things like the Global Eye, which is a surveillance aircraft that the Europeans are looking to buy from us. So that aviation's still going. Pardon? Not anymore. Stephen Harper changed that.
Still has a Challenger.
No, the Challengers are all sitting in Trenton, mothballed. Instead, they actually fly an Airbus. They took it, Stephen Harper painted it all up in nice, pretty livery. Trudeau still used that. And we now have a large Air Force One style jet that we took out of the Canadian military pile that was for, made it refueling and all those jobs. And the idea behind the Challenger was cheap, but it has the reason they stopped using it actually came from it does not qualify with the FAA as being safe anymore because it hasn't received those upgrades. Similar to Sussex Drive, it was one of those things that was kind of seen as, okay, well, does the Prime Minister need it to be fancy? And so over time, it just starts to be old.
How could that fly in Canada when our maintenance standards are higher?
That's what I said, they don't fly. They just sit on the runway. There's some in Ottawa, and there's some in Trenton. They could be fixed up, but they're looking at investing right now in the new Airbuses. So it was one of those, we'll just go with what we got. So in closing, the Avro killed the Arrow. The government did not, right? Kennedy wasn't even around to do it. And Avro made decisions that produced an aircraft with no market. The aircraft underperformed and was too expensive when compared to almost every one of its contemporaries. An aircraft that it did surpass would turn out and surpass the Avro Arrow in other regards, right? So we talk about the Voodoo. The Arrow was faster than the Voodoo, but the Voodoo could fly farther. It was safer, had more upgradability, right? So things, overall, the Arrow wasn't very good. The RCAF and the Canadian government had serious concerns about the problem, the whole program. And those concerns were from a Liberal government and a Conservative government, and finally it was just canceled because just economics could not play a role here. Canada had a variety of priorities and chose to spend elsewhere. There were better things to spend on that had more of an impact, whether that be the Argus that would hunt Soviet submarines off our coasts, whether that be the Starfighter, which would have a role of nuclear interdiction in Europe. Canada had a lot of responsibilities. The Arrow was just going to eat up all of that money. The impact of the unemployment was exaggerated. Yes, 25,000 people lost their job that day. Many found employment soon after. All right? Yes, we lost engineers, dozens, not thousands. And so when Diefenbaker's making that decision at that cabinet table, He's looking, do I invest all of our money? How angry are Canadians going to be? He has to say, and he comes down to that kind of thinking, well, if it's Avro or the health of the country, maybe it's got to be the country over Avro. Canadian aviation industry survived and thrived after the cancellation of the Avro Arrow. There, unfortunately, was no conspiracy. When looking objectively, the Diefenbaker government got it right. And yes, there's weird things. Chopping them all up looked bad. Where's 102? Sorry, where's 202? Where's 202, right? All of these kind of questions can be there. But at the end of the day, those are all explainable. And more likely to be able to be explained when we look at declassified documents, when we look at the readily available information that was spread throughout NATO, throughout the Warsaw Pact, of the capabilities of this plane, the capabilities of Canada to deliver. There's just no conspiracy there. The Americans actually wanted the project to succeed, and they thought about buying it till they learned about its gas tank. And then they kind of thought, nah, we're okay. Just like the British said, no, we're okay. And the Dutch said, no, we're okay. And Denmark said, no, we're okay. And Portugal said, no, we're okay. All of these potential markets that they may have had with a more conservative design. But instead, Avro swung for the fences. They wanted the next greatest thing. And I think we pick up a piece of that myth from the Avro wanted to be so bad the next greatest thing. But when we look at kind of empirical data, stuff we can review and we can see time and time again, it shows it was mediocre at best, very expensive, less capable than other options, and the cancellation was nothing wrong. There was nothing iffy about it. It seems like Diefenbaker had a bad choice ahead, and he decided to cancel the project. But it's important to see that when I showed you that information from the National Research Council, the Liberals were going to cancel it if they had won that election too. So you can't say it's on one man. It was a poor project. So that's my presentation for today. And I will open up to any questions if you have any, or comments, discussion. I'll go back there and then up to the front. Yep.